There are voices that don't just fill a room, they linger, long after the last note fades. And for anyone who ever heard Russell Tompkins Jr. glide into a falsetto, they remember exactly where they were the first time the Stylistics came through a speaker. Their sound wasn't loud or forceful. It was tender, almost fragile, the kind of soul music that made the world slow down for a moment. But how does a group that once defined the soft elegance of Philadelphia soul become a name whispered more in memory than in mainstream history? And why does their story still echo so deeply, even after the spotlight moved on? Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the Stylistics became one of the most beloved voices of Philadelphia soul, their journey began in a city where music floated through open windows and echoed down narrow streets. Philadelphia during the late 1960 decade was a place where soul music spoke for entire neighborhoods. It carried the dreams, frustrations, and hopes of people who found comfort in melody. In that environment, it was no surprise that a group of teenagers at Benjamin Franklin High School started shaping a sound that would one day travel far beyond their city. The school was an ordinary building of brick and long hallways, but inside it lived an extraordinary amount of talent. Two student groups had already made names for themselves. The Percussions, led by James Dunn and Herb Morrell, were admired for their harmony and discipline. The Monarchs, with Russell Tompkins Jr., James Smith, and Arian Love, drew attention for their smooth blend and Russell's unique falsetto. Even at a young age, his voice carried something tender and unmistakable, the kind of tone that made people lift their heads when he sang. Their paths crossed often. Classroom chatter, lunchroom conversations, and after-school gatherings all led back to the same question: who would take the spotlight at the next talent show? When the day arrived, the auditorium filled quickly. Students leaned forward, cheering for their favorite group, expecting a friendly musical showdown. What happened instead was a realization. The two groups, though different in style, complemented each other beautifully. Their harmonies blended in a way that felt fuller, richer, and unexpectedly powerful. After that performance, conversations began. What if they combined their strengths instead of competing? What if they tried to build something greater together? The idea grew, and by 1968, the five young men decided to merge into a single unit. They chose the name The Stylistics, a title that suggested elegance, polish, and intention. It hinted at the kind of group they wanted to become, even if they had not yet reached that level. In the early months, nothing about their path was easy. They performed wherever people would listen: school events, small clubs, community centers, and local neighborhoods. They had no major backing, no industry connections, just a desire to sing and a belief that their voices meant something. Those performances helped them learn who they were as a group. They discovered how to build harmonies around Russell's falsetto, how to control their blend, and how to hold the attention of an audience even in the smallest of rooms. Philadelphia played its part too. The city was changing socially and politically, and music became a refuge for many. The Stylistics absorbed everything around them. The sounds of church choirs, block parties, and radio stations spinning the latest soul hits shaped their instincts and taught them how to express emotion without shouting. Their approach became soft but deeply felt, a signature that would later define their legacy. Their first real opportunity came through Bill Perry, a local producer who heard the group and saw potential in their natural sound. Perry was not a major figure in the industry, but he believed in what they could become. He offered to help them record a song, paying $400 for studio time at Sigma Sound Studios. It was a modest budget, but for the Stylistics, it felt like a dream finally taking shape. Inside the studio, surrounded by simple equipment and raw determination, they recorded "You Are a Big Girl Now." The song carried the innocence of their early years, the emotion of young voices trying to express something genuine. Their manager Marty Bryant and musician Robert Douglas co-wrote the track, while Perry handled the production. There was no pressure then, no thought of charts or national recognition, only a desire to make something sincere. To their surprise, the song found an audience in Philadelphia. Local stations began playing it. People requested it late at night. The Stylistics, once just a high school idea, suddenly had a song traveling across their city. The growing buzz caught the attention of Avco Records, who didn't just hear potential in the track but recognized the magic inside the group. They signed the Stylistics, re-released the single, and watched as it climbed national charts. Beneath this early success was something more meaningful. The Stylistics were still young men with the same dreams they carried through high school hallways. Their beginnings were humble, grounded in friendship, competition, and a shared love for harmony. They could not know it yet, but every rehearsal, every late-night performance, and every step through Philadelphia's streets had prepared them for a journey that would eventually define a generation of soul music. When Avco Records stepped into the picture, the Stylistics found themselves crossing a threshold they once only imagined. The label heard "You Are a Big Girl," now not as a small local success, but as the early spark of something far greater. Once Avco re-released the single nationally, the song climbed to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 7 on the Billboard R&B chart. For a group that had started in high school hallways, this sudden rise felt surreal, almost like watching a dream materialize in real time. Success, however, did not change their instinctive approach to music. They were still young men learning to navigate studios, producers, and a rapidly shifting industry. But what they did have was a gift, a vocal identity that no other group could match. At the center of that identity was Russell Tompkins Jr. His falsetto was not simply high, it was expressive. It carried a softness that made even the simplest lyric feel personal. Producers and audiences alike recognized that Russell's voice was the emotional anchor of the group. It was the element that set the Stylistics apart. Even as they continued to perform locally, the group was slowly discovering how to translate their natural chemistry into polished recordings. Their harmonies, shaped by years of singing together in school, began to expand. They learned how to support Russell's falsetto without overwhelming it, how to let their backgrounds fill in the emotional spaces of a song. It was the early formation of what would become their signature, a sound defined by tenderness, control, and a certain quiet elegance. But the Stylistics were still missing one crucial element, something that would lift them from a promising act to a defining voice of their generation. That missing piece arrived in the form of producer Thom Bell. When Avco paired the group with Bell, everything changed. Bell was already respected for his work with the Delphonics and other rising acts. He had an ear for detail and a deep understanding of how to blend orchestration with emotion. In Russell, he saw a voice capable of shaping an entirely new direction for Philadelphia soul. Before the Bell era officially began, the Stylistics were simply young talents searching for their place. They recorded, rehearsed, and performed with dedication, but they were still defined more by potential than by accomplishment. Yet these early steps mattered. They taught the group who they were and what they wanted to sound like. They learned to trust their instincts and rely on one another. They began to understand how to turn harmonies into storytelling, how to let emotion guide arrangement, and how to make each note count. As the momentum built, their confidence grew. They were no longer just 5 young men from a Philadelphia high school. They were becoming artists with a direction, preparing for the moment when the right producer, the right songs, and the right opportunities would collide. That moment was closer than they realized. Thom Bell was about to take their raw talent and refine it into something extraordinary. And once he stepped into the studio with them, the Stylistics would never sound the same again. The true turning point for the Stylistics arrived the moment Thom Bell walked into the studio. Bell was not simply a producer. He was an architect of emotion, a man who understood how to turn vulnerability into melody and how to build entire worlds through orchestration. When he listened to the group, his attention immediately locked onto one thing: the fragile, floating beauty of Russell Tompkins Jr.'s falsetto. Bell knew instantly that this voice was the key to everything. From the beginning, Bell approached the Stylistics with intention. He gave them structure, discipline, and a vision that would define their place in soul music history. Bell took full creative control, shaping arrangements with sweeping strings, gentle horns, and rhythms that felt like they were made to cradle Russell's voice. Everything was crafted with precision. Every note served a purpose. And suddenly, the Stylistics were not just singing songs, they were telling stories. The results were immediate. Their self-titled debut album, guided entirely by Bell's direction, produced an astonishing series of hits. Stop, Look, Listen captured listeners with its simplicity and quiet warning. People Make the World Go Round became an anthem of reflection, blending soft vocals with a haunting arrangement that spoke to the social reality of the time. Betcha. By Golly Wow turned love into something almost weightless, a song that felt like floating. You Are Everything delivered heartfelt sincerity through a melody that wrapped itself around every listener who needed comfort. Each song felt different, yet all shared the same heartbeat, Russell's voice riding on top of Bell's orchestral soundscapes. It was not just music. It was elegance, vulnerability, and storytelling woven together. The Stylistics had officially found their identity. Audiences felt the shift too. Suddenly, the Stylistics were everywhere. Radio stations played their songs morning and night. Couples slow danced to their ballads. People found their memories intertwined with the group's sound. Their music became the soundtrack for weddings, heartbreaks, and quiet moments no one ever forgot. Critics praised their emotional honesty, while fans embraced the gentle sophistication that set them apart from other soul groups emerging at the time. Internationally, the reaction was just as powerful. The United Kingdom in particular embraced the Stylistics with open arms. Their soft orchestral soul fit perfectly into the UK's musical landscape, and their songs climbed the charts with ease. For many listeners overseas, the Stylistics became the sound of romance itself, a group whose music felt timeless, even in its first moment. But beneath the accolades and rising success, something deeper was happening. The group was beginning to understand the weight of their own potential. They were learning what it meant to carry a sound so distinct that it could not be mistaken for anyone else. And they were realizing that their partnership with Thom Bell was not just productive, it was transformative. This was the moment the Stylistics stepped fully into themselves. No longer a promising young group, they were now a defining voice of Philadelphia soul, shaping a decade with songs that would outlive the era that created them. The turning point was complete. Their rise had become unstoppable. The early 1970 decade marked the moment when the Stylistics rose from admired newcomers to icons. With Thom Bell guiding their sound and Linda Creed shaping the emotional core of their lyrics, the group stepped into a creative period that few artists ever experience. It was a time when nearly everything they recorded seemed destined to resonate deeply with people, a time when their music felt less like songs and more like memories waiting to happen. Their first major wave of success came with the release of their self-titled album. It was not just a collection of tracks, but a statement of who they were becoming. Each ballad carried a sense of vulnerability wrapped in orchestral grace. Songs like Stop, Look, Listen, and You Are Everything went beyond radio rotation. They became emotional markers for listeners who found pieces of themselves inside the lyrics. Betcha, by Golly Wow, perhaps their most cherished hit of the era, felt like a whisper turned into melody, a reminder that tenderness could be powerful when delivered with honesty. What defined their peak more than anything else was the combination of Russell Tompkins Jr.'s falsetto and Bell's lush arrangements. Russell sang with a delicacy that drew people closer, as if he were revealing something he rarely said aloud. Bell surrounded that voice with strings, horns, and harmonies that lifted every emotion higher. Together, they created a sound that set the Stylistics apart from every other group of the time. But their triumph was not confined to the studio. On stage, the Stylistics embodied elegance. They wore tailored suits in soft colors, moved with calm confidence, and performed with a sense of grace that made every concert feel intimate. They did not rely on flashy choreography or overwhelming energy. Instead, they relied on stillness, harmonies, and the quiet power of sincerity. Audiences appreciated that authenticity. People did not just listen, they felt. As the group's music spread, something remarkable happened across the Atlantic. The United Kingdom embraced the Stylistics with a devotion that surprised even the band. Their soft, romantic sound matched perfectly with the UK's taste during that period. British fans treated the Stylistics as the soundtrack of love, dedicating songs to partners, playing them at weddings, and letting them drift through quiet evenings. Their popularity in the UK became a phenomenon, one that even outshined their success in the United States for certain periods. Meanwhile, back home, their presence on the charts confirmed that they were no longer rising stars. They were established voices in soul music. Break Up to Make Up, I'm Stone in Love with You, and You Make Me Feel Brand New solidified their place among the greatest soul groups of the era. The latter song, with its slow-build arrangement and deeply emotional message, became an anthem for those who wanted to express gratitude and devotion without needing many words. At this peak, the Stylistics represented something rare. They brought refinement to soul music, proving that quiet emotion could be just as powerful as strong vocal runs or heavy beats. Their music was gentle but unforgettable, soft but enduring. They created a space for listeners to breathe, to reflect, and to feel seen. This period was not just the height of their career, it was a defining chapter in American soul music. And for the Stylistics, it was the moment when everything aligned: the talent, the timing, the sound, and the world's readiness to hear them. Their triumph was complete. At the height of their success, the Stylistics seemed untouchable. Their music filled radio stations, their albums climbed charts with ease, and their presence in the soul landscape felt permanent. But behind the elegance and the gentle harmonies, quiet changes were beginning to unfold. Changes that would slowly pull the group away from the golden era Thom Bell had helped them create. The first shift came when their partnership with Bell ended. It marked more than the close of a professional relationship. It marked the loss of the architect who had helped shape their signature sound. Without Bell's orchestral arrangements and emotional precision, the Stylistics stood at a crossroads. They were still talented, still adored, but the musical world around them was evolving quickly. Soul was becoming grittier, funkier, more rhythmic. The Stylistics' soft, romantic styles suddenly felt out of step with a landscape that was changing beneath their feet. In an effort to keep pace, the group began working with producer Van McCoy. McCoy brought a lighter, pop-oriented feel to their music. The arrangements grew sunnier, more polished, and at times less anchored in the emotional depth that had defined their earlier work. It was not that the music was bad. It simply was not what audiences had come to love from the Stylistics. Something essential had been softened, and longtime fans could feel the shift. The results became clear on the charts. While the group continued to find remarkable success in the United Kingdom, their presence in the United States began to fade. American radio, once open to their gentle storytelling, had moved on to new trends. The Stylistics found themselves caught between artistic identity and industry pressure. They wanted to evolve, but evolution without direction can feel like drift. At the same time, pressures inside the group began to surface. Creative disagreements, fatigue from constant touring, and uncertainty about their future crept into their dynamic. What had once been a united front of driven young men now felt more fragile. The harmony on stage remained flawless, but the harmony behind the scenes had begun to crack. Looking back, the seeds of their decline were not sudden. They were subtle. A change in producer, a shift in sound, a music industry evolving at a pace no one could predict. The Stylistics were still beloved, still respected, but the winds were turning. And even a group built on elegance and emotion could not avoid the quiet storms gathering around them. As the mid-1970 decade unfolded, the momentum that once carried the Stylistics to the top of the soul world began to slow in ways that were subtle at first, then unmistakable. Leaving Avco and moving to H&L Records should have offered a fresh start, but instead, it revealed how fragile their position had become without Thom Bell's guiding hand. The material they recorded lacked the emotional depth and orchestral richness that had defined their greatest hits. Songs were still polished, still pleasant, but they no longer carried the same heartbeat. The group could feel it. They were professionals, but they were also human. They knew when a track felt right, and they knew when something essential had slipped away. The music industry, always moving, did not pause for them to catch up. Radio stations leaned toward newer trends. Audiences, once captivated by the tenderness of their ballads, were now gravitating toward sounds that were bolder, more rhythmic, and more aligned with the cultural shifts happening across the country. For the Stylistics, the pressure was heavier than anyone outside the group could see. Imagine being known for a sound so pure, so delicate, that even a small shift could break the magic. Imagine trying to adapt without losing the identity that gave you a place in the first place. That was the struggle they faced every day in the studio. Each recording session became a search for something that felt increasingly out of reach. By 1978, the reality was impossible to ignore. The hits had stopped coming. Songs that should have charted barely received airplay. 2 albums released under Mercury Records added to the weight of disappointment when neither managed to break through. For a group that once seemed unable to miss, the silence from the charts was disorienting. Russell Tompkins Jr., whose voice had carried so much of the group's emotional expression, later admitted that the Stylistics began to feel their music was outdated. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, the kind that revealed how deeply they cared about their craft. They were not chasing fame. They were chasing a feeling, a connection, something real. And when they could no longer find it in the songs placed before them, the frustration grew. At the same time, internal stresses began to take shape. Years of touring, recording, and navigating changing expectations took a toll. Creative disagreements surfaced. Long hours on the road made fatigue a constant companion. The unity that once defined them started to strain. James Dunn, one of the original voices that helped shape their harmony, left the group before the release of Hurry Up This Way Again. His departure marked the first time the Stylistics performed as a quartet. It was not just a personnel change. It was a sign that the emotional weight of their journey was beginning to show, that even a group built on harmony could not escape the pressures gathering around them. In these years, the Stylistics were fighting 2 battles at once, one against a changing industry, the other within themselves. And for the first time, the path forward no longer felt certain. The late 1970 decade marked a turning point where the consequences of the Stylistics' struggles became impossible to ignore. After their move to Mercury Records, hopes ran high that a new label might restore some of the magic they once carried so effortlessly. Instead, 2 albums came and went without chart success. The silence was painful, not because they expected constant triumph, but because they recognized how far their sound had drifted from the emotional truth that once defined them. For the first time in their career, the group faced the unmistakable reality of being left behind. The music world had changed. Trends shifted quickly. Radio no longer looked their way. Their soft, romantic soul was now considered out of step with newer styles that demanded louder production and more aggressive rhythms. What they offered was still heartfelt, still sincere, but in the eyes of the industry, it no longer fit the moment. Inside the group, the atmosphere grew heavier. What had once been simple decisions became complicated. Creative differences, once manageable, deepened. The emotional toll of declining success pressed on everyone differently. James Smith, another founding member whose voice had helped anchor their harmonies, eventually chose to walk away after the album Closer Than Close in 1981. His departure followed James Dunn's exit just a year earlier, leaving the group in a state of constant adjustment. Every exit reshaped their identity. Each shift in membership felt like losing a piece of their original chemistry, the very chemistry that made them stand out in their early years. The harmony remained professional, but it no longer carried the same familiar warmth. They were a trio now. Love, Morell, and Tompkins stood together, determined to continue, but there was no denying the weight of everything they had endured. Yet even within these difficult years, there were moments of light. Their reunion with Thom Bell in 1980 brought a brief return to form. The single Hurry Up This Way Again reached number 18 on the R&B chart, reminding listeners of the emotional beauty the Stylistics could still deliver when given the right foundation. It was a flicker of the past, a reminder of what once was. But flickers are not flames. The industry had moved on, and the world that once embraced their gentle sound now treated it like a nostalgic whisper. For the Stylistics, the consequences of this shift were profound. The applause that had once followed them everywhere grew faint. The stages changed. The crowds thinned. Still, through all of it, they kept singing. Even when the world stopped watching, they held on to the music that had carried them from a high school auditorium to international fame. And in that quiet persistence, there was dignity. By the time the 1980 decade arrived, the Stylistics had already carved their place into the landscape of American soul music. Even as the commercial momentum of their early years began to fade, their influence continued to ripple outward in ways that neither the group nor the industry fully understood at the time. Music has a way of preserving what the world forgets, and in the case of the Stylistics, the songs they created during their peak years became timeless markers of tenderness and emotional truth. What made their impact endure was not just the success of their records, but the unmistakable signature of their sound. Russell Tompkins Jr.'s falsetto stood as one of the most distinct voices to ever come out of Philadelphia. It did not rely on power or force. It relied on purity, on restraint, on the quiet vulnerability that made listeners feel as if he were singing directly to them. For many, that voice became the standard for soft soul expression. It influenced not only vocalists within their era but generations that followed. You can hear hints of the Stylistics in the emotional delivery of artists who came decades later. Singers like Maxwell, Prince, and El DeBarge carried echoes of Russell's smooth, floating tone. Even in the world of contemporary R&B, artists found themselves returning to the gentle, heartfelt delivery that the Stylistics perfected. Their music proved that tenderness did not equal weakness. It could be powerful, moving, and unforgettable. Beyond their vocal style, the group also left a deep imprint on songwriting and production. Thom Bell's arrangements, paired with the voice of the Stylistics, created a template for orchestral soul that would be studied, sampled, and admired for years to come. The blend of sweeping strings, warm horns, and controlled harmonies became a defining element of the Philadelphia sound. Later, producers used these textures as inspiration, weaving similar colors into new genres and new eras. Hip-hop and modern R&B artists, in particular, found treasure in the Stylistics catalog. Mary J. Blige's song Everything drew directly from You Are Everything. Usher's Love, In This Club. Part 2 carried pieces of their melodic DNA. Jennifer Lopez, LaToya Luckett, and many others built new creations on the emotional foundations laid by the Stylistics. Their songs were sampled not just because they were beautiful, but because they carried a feeling that could not be reproduced by any other group. Their legacy also lived far beyond American borders. In the United Kingdom, their influence only grew stronger with time. British listeners embraced the Stylistics not as a nostalgic act, but as an essential part of their musical identity. British soul groups, pop artists, and even emerging contemporary singers considered the Stylistics a foundational inspiration. Their concerts in the UK continued to draw crowds long after their US chart presence faded, a testament to the deep emotional connection they built with fans overseas. Through all these layers of influence, one truth became clear. The Stylistics were not defined by a single decade or a moment in the spotlight. They were defined by the emotional honesty they brought into every note they sang. Their legacy lived in wedding songs, in slow dances, in quiet nights when someone needed comfort, in memories that resurfaced the moment one of their melodies played. The world changed, styles shifted, but the heart they poured into their music never lost its ability to reach people. That is the kind of legacy that lasts. As the years moved forward, something remarkable happened. Even though the Stylistics were no longer dominating charts or shaping the direction of mainstream radio, the public's connection to their music deepened. Time has a way of revealing which artists created moments and which artists created memories. For the Stylistics, their impact belonged firmly to the second category. In America, their recognition shifted from active chart presence to heartfelt nostalgia. Fans who grew up with their songs held on to them as precious fragments of their past. Couples who danced to You Make Me Feel Brand New on their wedding day. Families who played Betcha by Golly Wow during weekend gatherings. Parents who hummed Stop, Look, Listen while driving home after long shifts. These memories became the group's true legacy. Even as new generations discovered different sounds, the Stylistics remained a touchstone for listeners who valued tenderness in music. Their songs were featured in films, radio segments, and sentimental playlists that reminded people of gentler times. On the global stage, their influence took a different shape. In the United Kingdom, admiration for the Stylistics never faded. British audiences embraced them not as a group from the past, but as a continuing force. Their tours across the UK drew fans who sang every word, who viewed their music as part of the fabric of British soul culture. While American listeners revisited the Stylistics with affection, British listeners celebrated them with steadfast loyalty. It was a relationship built on decades of emotional connection. This admiration eventually led to formal recognition. In 1994, the Stylistics were honored with induction into the Philadelphia Music Alliance Walk of Fame. A decade later, in 2004, they were inducted into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame. These honors acknowledged what fans had known all along, that the Stylistics were not merely a successful group, but a group whose music left an enduring imprint on the soul of American culture. What made this recognition especially meaningful was the journey that preceded it. They were a group that tasted soaring success and then weathered years of quiet struggle. They endured shifting musical landscapes, internal changes, and moments when the world looked away, yet their music remained. It traveled, survived, and found new audiences long after their chart-topping days ended. In the end, tribute came not only from institutions but from those who still played their records, who shared their songs with younger generations, who felt something when Russell Tompkins Jr.'s falsetto carried a lyric into the air. That is how the Stylistics were remembered, not as a forgotten chapter, but as a gentle, irreplaceable voice in the story of modern soul. When we look back on the story of the Stylistics, it becomes clear that their journey was never just about music. It was about the quiet power of emotion, the beauty of sincerity, and the courage it takes to hold on to gentleness in a world that often demands something louder. From the moment their voices first blended in a high school auditorium to the years when their songs traveled through radios across the country, the Stylistics carried a kind of softness that left a lasting mark on everyone who listened. Their rise, their triumphs, and even their struggles reflected something deeply human. They showed that success can be breathtaking, but also delicate. That fame can shine brightly, but fade quietly, and yet, what they created in their finest moments did not disappear. It remained in the hearts of those who found pieces of their own lives inside the harmonies. The falsetto that once felt almost fragile became a symbol of strength. The melodies that accompanied first loves, quiet nights, and tender memories became a part of people's lives long after the charts moved on. As we revisit their legacy, one truth stands out. The world may not always celebrate its gentle voices, but it never forgets them. The Stylistics left behind songs that carried honesty, warmth, and vulnerability. They offered listeners a place to rest, a place to breathe, a place to feel. And in doing so, they earned something far more enduring than a moment at the top of the charts. They earned a place in the emotional history of American soul. Even now, decades after their breakthrough, their music continues to travel. It appears in samples, in films, in playlists meant to soften the edges of life. Their influence is heard in artists who were not yet born when the Stylistics first stepped onto a stage. And every time Russell Tompkins Jr.'s voice rises in one of those familiar melodies, it reminds us that some sounds are too pure to fade. So as we close this chapter, we return to where we began, the quiet image of a soft falsetto lingering in the air, long after the lights have dimmed. The Stylistics may not have always received the full recognition they deserved, but their music stands as a testament to what gentle artistry can achieve. It stands as a reminder that the heart remembers what the world sometimes overlooks. Do you think Hollywood and the music industry ever gave the Stylistics the respect they truly earned? If their story touched you, leave a message for them in the comments. And if you want to help preserve the memories of artists who shaped the soundtrack of our lives, hit that subscribe button and keep their light alive.